Warren did not use a knife to cut away the 34 years we had built together. He used the overhead lighting in our kitchen. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The draft from the back porch was sneaking under the door, smelling of damp earth and dying leaves. I was standing near the sink, rinsing the grease from the heavy cast-iron skillet we'd received as a wedding gift in 1992. Warren sat at the oak island, his tablet propped against a salt shaker, the screen reflecting two small blue squares in his pupils. "You should look into those creams," he said. His voice was casual, the same tone he used when telling me the oil in the sedan needed changing. "The ones they advertise on the morning news, for the under eyes." I kept my back to him, my hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. "My eyes?" "The skin is dropping," he said, tapping his screen to scroll through an article. "Like it's giving up. I noticed it when we were at the pharmacy yesterday. Under that fluorescent lighting, Gail, you looked like your mother. It's those deep brackets around your mouth, too. Makes you look like you're permanently disappointed." He didn't look up to see if the blow landed. He didn't need to. In Warren's mind, he was simply stating a structural fact, the way he used to estimate the cost of dry rot in a client's foundation during his years as a building contractor. "I'm 58, Warren," I said, my voice thin, flat, almost lost beneath the sound of the running faucet. "I know how old you are," he replied, his index finger sliding across the glass. "But 58 doesn't have to look like 98. I'm 60, and I don't have those folds. It's about maintenance, Gail. You've just let gravity do whatever it wants." A husband does not wake up one morning and decide his wife is old. It is a slow, silent subtraction. First, he stops looking at her eyes when she speaks. Then he stops looking at her face entirely, treating her instead like a familiar piece of furniture that has faded from too many afternoons in the sun. You become an aesthetic inconvenience in your own home. I dried my hands on the tea towel, the fabric coarse against my palms. I didn't yell. I didn't point out that the gray hair at his temples was thinning into a dry, wispy crown, or that his posture had begun to curve inward like an old porch joist. I simply walked to the pantry, set the skillet on its hook, and closed the door. The silence between us wasn't the loud, angry kind that follows an argument. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty well. The next afternoon, our son Wesley stopped by to drop off his winter tires in our garage. He was 31, always hurried, always smelling of coffee and dry-cleaned wool. He didn't step into the kitchen. He stood in the mudroom, his boots leaving wet, dark outlines on the linoleum I had scrubbed that morning. "Hey, Mom," he said, checking his watch. "Dad said you guys might have some of those old storage bins left over, the plastic ones. Joanne wants to pack away the baby clothes." "They're in the basement, Wes," I said, coming to the doorway. "Under the stairs. I can get them for you." "Great, thanks." He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on his phone, his thumb moving with the same rhythmic, detached speed as his father's. "Oh, and Dad mentioned something about a dinner next week, some consulting thing he's doing. He wants you to wear that dark blue dress, the one from the anniversary." "Did he?" "Yeah, he said he's trying to make a good impression on some new client. Marin, I think her name is, some young designer who's helping him modernize his website." Wesley finally looked up, his eyes skimming over my face for a fraction of a second before returning to his screen. "You look tired, Mom. You getting enough sleep?" "I'm sleeping fine, Wesley." "Good. Don't forget those bins. I'm in a rush." When he left, the front door clicked shut with a small metallic sound that echoed through the quiet house. I stood in the mudroom for a long time, watching the dust motes drift through the pale light coming from the transom window. In a family, the mother is often the anchor, but an anchor is only thought of when the ship begins to drift. The rest of the time, it is simply left in the dark, cold water, expected to hold the weight of everything else without ever needing to breathe. I had spent 30 years smoothing over Warren's sharp edges, translating his gruffness to our children so they wouldn't grow up fearing him, and keeping the quiet rhythm of our life moving forward. That evening, while Warren was in the shower, I went out to his sedan to retrieve my reading glasses, which I'd left in the glove compartment. The car smelled of his cologne, something expensive and pine-scented he'd recently started buying, and leather. As I searched the console, my hand brushed against a small, heavy paper bag tucked beneath the passenger seat. It was from a boutique downtown, the kind of place where a single silk scarf cost more than our weekly grocery budget. I pulled it out. Inside was a small box wrapped in cream-colored tissue. I opened it. It wasn't a scarf. It was a gold necklace, delicate, with a small, raw emerald pendant that caught the dim light of the garage. The green was deep, cold, and entirely wrong for my skin tone. I had never worn emerald. Warren knew I only wore silver and muted pearls. Tucked into the side of the box was a small, cream-colored card. The handwriting wasn't Warren's heavy, blocky print. It was a light, looping script that leaned forward as if it were in a hurry to get to the end of the page. To new structures and brighter elevations, thank you for seeing the potential. There was no signature. I sat in the passenger seat, the leather cold beneath me, holding the small gold chain between my fingers. The garage was silent, except for the rhythmic drip of condensation from the air conditioner unit onto the concrete floor. From the house, I heard the bathroom door open, followed by the faint sound of Warren whistling a tune he hadn't whistled in years. I carefully folded the tissue paper back over the necklace, placed the box in the bag, and slid it back under the passenger seat, exactly as I had found it. When I went back inside, Warren was standing in front of the hallway mirror, wearing a new linen shirt. He was leaning close to the glass, using his fingers to smooth the skin at his temples, searching for the youth he believed he still deserved. "Did you find your glasses?" he asked, not looking at me through the mirror, but at his own reflection. "No," I said quietly, standing in the shadow of the doorway. "I must have left them somewhere else." "You really should get your eyes checked, Gail," he said, turning his head to inspect his profile. "You've been squinting a lot lately. It's making those lines between your brows look much deeper than they actually are." I watched him. His hands were clean, his fingernails neatly trimmed. For 30 years, those hands had been rough, scarred from cedar splinters and mortar. Now they were soft. He had stopped working with wood and stone 2 years ago, choosing instead to consult, a word that seemed to involve a lot of long lunches and late-night emails in his study with the door closed. "I'll look into it," I said. "Good," he said, turning off the hallway light and leaving me standing in the dark. "We have that dinner on Thursday. I need you looking your best. It's important." The navy blue dress had been purchased 4 years ago for our 31st anniversary. It was made of heavy, structured crepe that used to hug my waist, but as I stood before the bedroom mirror, I noticed how the fabric now pooled slightly over my hips. I had lost weight over the summer, not through diet or exercise, but through the quiet, calorie-burning labor of carrying a worry I couldn't yet name. Warren stood behind me, adjusting his collar in the glass. He had spent 10 minutes choosing a watch. "You're not wearing the pearls?" he asked, his eyes dropping to my bare collarbone. "The clasp is loose," I said. I didn't want to risk losing them. He frowned, a small, tight line forming between his brows. "Well, put something on. Your neck looks very bare, Gail. It draws attention to the skin there. Use some of that cream I bought you for your birthday." "That was hand cream, Warren." "Skin is skin," he said, turning away to grab his keys from the dresser. "Just make sure you do something with your hair. It's looking a bit flat. Marin is very detail-oriented. She notices things." I looked at my reflection after he left the room. My hair was graying at the temples, a soft, silver-threaded brown that I had stopped coloring 2 years ago when the chemical smell began to give me migraines. Warren had protested then, too, claiming it made him look older by association. I touched the side of my neck where the skin was soft and thin like tissue paper. I didn't apply the hand cream. I simply walked out to the car. The restaurant was a new high-end bistro downtown called The Foundry. It was the kind of place with exposed brick, dim lighting, and concrete floors that bounced the sound of silverware and chatter around the room like small, sharp rocks. It was designed for younger crowds, people who didn't mind shouting to be heard over indie rock. Marin was already seated when we arrived. She was 32, perhaps 33. She had the kind of effortless, scrubbed-clean beauty that only belongs to women who have never had to worry about the cost of a dental crown or a utility bill. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, low knot, revealing a neck that was smooth and long. She wore a simple charcoal gray cashmere sweater. But it was her scent that reached me first as Warren guided me to the booth. Jasmine and vanilla with a sharp undertone of cedar. It was the exact scent that had been clinging to the passenger seat headrest of Warren's sedan for the past 3 weeks. I had smelled it every time I got in to go to the grocery store, assuming it was a new air freshener he'd tried. "Marin, this is Gail," Warren said, his voice dropping into a warm, resonant register I hadn't heard him use at home in years. He pulled out the chair for her first, his hand lingering on the wood for a fraction of a second before he remembered to slide into the booth next to me. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, Gail," Marin said, offering a small, polite smile. Her eyes did a quick professional sweep of my face, my hair, and the slightly loose navy blue dress. "Warren talks about you all the time." "Does he?" I asked, keeping my hands folded in my lap beneath the white linen napkin. "Oh, absolutely," she said, leaning forward. "He says you're the rock of the family, the quiet one who keeps the machinery running while he's out in the world." The machinery. When a man wants to leave his life, he doesn't start with the mortgage or the bank accounts. He starts by rewriting his wife's history. He turns her decades of quiet devotion into a boring habit, and her silence into a lack of intellect. To Marin, I was already a domestic appliance, functional, necessary for the household's hygiene, but entirely devoid of mystery. "I keep the house," I said simply. "Warren has always preferred the outside." Warren let out a short, forced laugh. "Gail's a homebody, always has been. If it were up to her, we'd still have the same wallpaper we put up in '94. "There's nothing wrong with classic Warren," Marin said, her voice soft, almost reassuring. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely too familiar, a mixture of professional deference and personal amusement. "But in our industry, if you don't modernize, you die. Your brand needs to look like it belongs in this decade." "Exactly," Warren agreed, leaning in so close his shoulder brushed mine. "That's why I brought you on. I felt like the business was looking tired, clunky." He used those words often lately. Tired, clunky, aged. He used them to describe his old truck, our living room sofa, and the way I walked after a long afternoon spent pulling weeds in the garden. As the waiter brought our drinks, I watched Marin's hands. Her nails were short, unpainted, but perfectly shaped. On her right wrist, she wore a thin gold band. It wasn't the emerald necklace from the car. That was likely waiting for a private evening, perhaps a celebration when the new brand was launched. But the gold was the exact same shade. Throughout the meal, the conversation moved around me like water around a stone. They talked about color palettes, digital landing pages, and search engine optimization. Warren hung on her every word, nodding with an intensity that made him look desperate. He laughed at her small jokes, his hand occasionally reaching out to tap the table near her water glass to emphasize a point. I sat quietly, chewing my salmon, which had gone cold and dry. "You're very quiet, Gail," Marin said during a lull in the conversation. She tilted her head, her expression hovering between polite concern and mild superiority. "Am I boring you with all this tech talk?" "Not at all," I said, putting down my fork. "I was just thinking about the house we built in '98, the one in the valley." Warren's smile stiffened. "Gail, we're not talking about residential builds right now." "You used cedar shakes for the siding," I continued, looking directly at Marin. "Warren wanted to use vinyl because it was cheaper and lasted longer without maintenance. But I spent 3 weeks sanding those shakes by hand in the garage so we could stain them. I wanted the house to look like it belonged to the hill it was sitting on." Marin's eyes flickered, a small, sharp realization passing behind her pupils before she masked it with a smile. "That sounds like a lot of work." "It was," I said, but Warren liked the result. He took all the credit when the local real estate magazine did a feature on it. The silence that followed was small, but it was heavy. Warren's jaw tightened, the muscle near his ear pulsing once, twice. He reached for his wine glass, taking a long sip before speaking. "That was a long time ago, Gail," he said, his voice dropping its warm register entirely. "Things are different now. People want efficiency. Nobody cares about cedar shakes anymore." When the bill arrived, Warren paid before Marin could even reach for her purse. He dismissed her polite protests with a wave of his hand. "Please," he said, "it's on the company. Write it off as creative development." We walked out to the parking lot together. The autumn air had grown sharper, the wind rustling the paper cups and dry leaves in the gutters. As we stood by Marin's small, modern hatchback, she turned to Warren, her eyes shining in the yellow glare of the streetlights. "Thank you for dinner, Warren," she said. Then she turned to me, her expression perfectly controlled. "It was so nice to meet the woman behind the man, Gail." "Likewise," I said. She unlocked her car. Before she got in, she looked over the roof at Warren. "I love the new leather seats in your sedan, by the way. They're so comfortable, especially on those long drives out to the Chester site." She smiled, got in, and pulled out of the parking lot. I stood beside Warren in the cold. He didn't look at me. He was watching her taillights disappear around the corner, his breathing shallow and quick. "She's very talented," he said, more to himself than to me. "She smells like your car, Warren," I said quietly. He froze. His hand, which had been sliding into his coat pocket, stopped. He turned his head slowly, his eyes dark, searching my face in the dim light of the parking lot to see how much I knew. "She's a client, Gail," he said, his voice dropping into that cold, defensive tone he used when he was caught in a calculation. "We travel to sites together. It saves on mileage." "I see," I said. I didn't ask about the green box under the seat. I didn't demand to know if she had already touched the gold chain. I simply walked to the passenger side of the sedan, opened the door, and sat down in the scent of jasmine and vanilla. The drive home was 40 minutes of unbroken gray noise. The hum of the tires against the wet asphalt of Route 202 was the only thing filling the cabin of the sedan. Warren kept both hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly white, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He was driving 5 miles over the speed limit, a small physical manifestation of his impatience, his desire to escape the cramped space of his own guilt. "You made things very awkward tonight, Gail," he said finally, not turning his head. His voice was tight, clipped at the edges. "Bringing up that old house in the valley. Marin is a professional. She doesn't care about our domestic history." "It isn't domestic history, Warren," I said, watching the streetlights paint long, pale yellow lines across my lap. "It was the foundation of your company. You used that feature in the magazine to secure the commercial contract for the township library. That was 25 years ago. The industry has moved on. I have moved on." He tapped his index finger against the leather steering wheel. "But you're still standing in the same spot, holding on to things that don't matter anymore. It's embarrassing." "Is it my age that embarrasses you, or the memory of what we used to be?" He let out a short, sharp breath, a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. "This is exactly what I mean. You turn everything into some deep, dramatic tragedy. I'm trying to build something new, to keep us afloat in a market that doesn't care about 60-year-old men. Marin has the vision to do that. She's helping me. You should be thanking her, not making passive-aggressive comments about how she smells." "I only stated a fact," I said softly. "It was a cheap shot," he snapped. He pulled the sedan into our driveway, the headlights sweeping across the dark, neat front of our split-level home. He cut the engine, but he didn't get out. The sudden silence of the car was heavy, smelling of cold leather and the lingering trace of jasmine. "And for the record, I gave her a ride to the site last Tuesday because her car was in the shop. I am not going to apologize for being a decent colleague." He opened his door and slammed it shut, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the house. I sat in the dark passenger seat for a moment longer. A woman who has spent 30 years keeping a home clean knows exactly where the dirt collects. You learn to read the small shifts, the way a rug is slightly askew, the way a drawer doesn't close quite right, the way a husband's voice rises half an octave when he is trying to defend a lie. I didn't argue. I didn't follow him into his study to demand a confession. I went upstairs, washed my face with cold water, and lay down on my side of our queen-size bed, staring at the dark ceiling. An hour later, I heard his footsteps in the hallway. He didn't come into our bedroom. He went down the hall to the guest room, the door clicking shut with a quiet, deliberate finality. The next morning, the house was empty by 7. Warren had left a note on the kitchen island. Site visits in Lancaster, back late, written in his hurried, blocky script. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat at the small roll-top desk in the corner of the kitchen. This was my station. For 3 decades, I had managed our lives from this corner. I kept the folders of tax returns, the medical receipts, the school records, and the household ledger. Warren built the structures, but I managed the space inside them. I opened the laptop and logged into our joint bank account. Our finances had always been simple. Warren's Consulting LLC had its own business account, but every month he transferred a set amount into our joint household checking to cover the mortgage, the insurance, and the living expenses. I clicked on the transaction history for his business account. Because I had set up the LLC's tax profile 10 years ago, I still had the login credentials saved in my browser. My eyes moved down the column of numbers. 3 weeks ago, there was a withdrawal of $12,000 listed simply as professional services. 2 days after that, a charge of $420 at L'Etoile Boutique, the shop downtown where the green box had come from. And then, on Monday of this week, another transfer of $10,000 from our personal savings account into his business account. He hadn't mentioned it to me. He hadn't asked. He had simply moved the money, leaving our retirement cushion $10,000 thinner. I sat very still, the coffee mug warm against my palms. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall, a steady mechanical sound that seemed to measure the slow collapse of my life. $10,000 was the money we had set aside for the roof repairs we needed next spring. It was the security we had spent 30 years accumulating, dollar by dollar, coupon by coupon. The front door clicked open, and the sound of high heels on the hardwood startled me. "Mom, you home?" It was Joanne, Wesley's wife. She was 30, a tall, thin girl who always looked as though she were in the middle of a minor crisis. She was carrying her 3-year-old daughter Maisie on her hip, along with a heavy canvas diaper bag. "In the kitchen, Joanne," I said, closing the laptop screen halfway. Joanne walked in, her face flushed, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun. She set Maisie down on the linoleum, and the little girl immediately toddled toward the basket of wooden blocks I kept under the island. "Thank God you're here," Joanne said, dropping the diaper bag onto a chair. "Wesley's got some big meeting in Wilmington today, and my mother went to the dentist, and I have that dental hygiene seminar at 9. Can you watch Maisie until 1? I'm desperate." "Of course," I said, rising to pour her a cup of coffee. "Sit down for a minute." "I can't," she said, though she slid onto one of the bar stools anyway, sighing as she rubbed her temples. "I'm running on 3 hours of sleep. Maisie has been teething, and Wesley is so stressed about his new territory at work. He thinks if he doesn't hit his quarterly numbers, they're going to restructure his department." She took a sip of the coffee, her eyes scanning the kitchen. Everything looks so clean here. I don't know how you do it, Gail. My house looks like a bomb went off. But I guess it's easier when you don't have kids in the house anymore. You have all the time in the world. Quiet time isn't always easy, Joanne, I said softly, setting a plate of sliced apples on the low table for Maisie. Oh, I'm sure, Joanne said, her tone light, dismissive in the way young people are when they look at those who have already crossed the river they are still swimming in. But at least you and Dad have it all figured out. You don't have to worry about the future. She paused, setting her mug down. Oh, by the way, I saw Dad yesterday afternoon. I was coming out of the pediatrician's office on Market Street, and I saw his car parked outside that new French bakery. I was going to walk over and say hi, but he was with that young girl, the designer, Marin. My hand, which was holding the coffee pot, stayed perfectly still. Yes, she's helping him with his website. Right, Joanne said, reaching for her purse. They looked so intense. She was showing him something on her tablet, and he was laughing. It's funny. I don't think I've seen Dad laugh like that since Wesley's graduation. He looked, I don't know, younger. It's great he has that fresh energy around the office. Wesley says Dad was getting really grumpy before he retired. She stood up, checking her phone. Anyway, I have to run. There's clean diapers in the bag, and she has some crackers if she gets fussy. Thank you so much, Mom. You're a lifesaver. She leaned down, kissed the top of Maisie's head, and then looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. You look really pale today, Gail. Are you feeling okay? You should try that cream blush I got you for Christmas. It really helps when the skin starts to get that dry, gray look. I'm fine, I said, just a little tired. Well, get some rest while she naps, Joanne said, already halfway out the door. See you at 1. The door closed. In the kitchen, Maisie sat on the floor, banging 2 wooden blocks together. Clack, clack, clack. I looked down at the laptop screen, which was still glowing in the dim light of the kitchen corner. The numbers hadn't changed. The $10,000 was still gone. I reached out, clicked the mouse, and began to print the transaction history for the last 6 months. Maisie fell asleep on my shoulder at 11. She was warm, her small chest rising and falling against mine, her breath smelling of the milk and apple slices we'd shared. I sat in the rocking chair in the nursery, a room we had kept painted a soft, neutral yellow for when the grandchildren came to stay. As I rocked her, I looked at her small, perfect hands. I wondered how many years it would take before someone taught her to keep her voice down, to clean up messes she hadn't made, and to smile when she was hollowed out inside. It is a quiet curriculum, passed from mother to daughter, not through words, but through the heavy, uncomplaining way we move through the rooms of our homes. Once Maisie was settled in the crib, I went back down to the kitchen. The printer had finished its work. A neat stack of 24 pages lay in the tray, warm to the touch. I took the pages to Warren's study. The room was larger than the other bedrooms, lined with dark pine shelving he'd built himself back when he still took pride in his hands. It smelled of the vanilla-scented pipe tobacco he had recently taken up, a habit that felt as forced and artificial as his new linen shirts. I sat at his mahogany desk. On top of his blotter was a leather-bound planner. I opened it to next month. There, in his blocky handwriting, across 4 days in November, was written Savannah Conference. Beneath it, in a lighter looping script that I recognized immediately from the cream-colored card in his car, Flight 412, 2:15 p.m., stay at the Gastonian. There was no mention of a second ticket in his planner, but I knew the hotel. It was a small, romantic bed and breakfast, not the kind of place where a business consultant stayed to attend a digital marketing seminar. I opened the browser on his desktop computer. His history was open, a long list of searches for restaurants in Savannah, carriage rides, and boutique jewelers. But it was his social media bookmarks that pulled at me. I didn't have an Instagram account. Warren had always told me it was for people with nothing better to do. But Marin's professional page was public. I scrolled through her feed. It was a curated gallery of clean white rooms, minimalist office spaces, and flat lays of fabric swatches. And then, 4 weeks ago, a photo of 2 wine glasses on a rustic wooden table in Lancaster. The caption read, "Late night brainstorming with my favorite visionary, building the future from the ground up." In the bottom left corner of the frame, resting on the dark wood next to Marin's glass, was a man's hand. The silver watch with the scratched bezel, the one Warren's grandfather had given him for his high school graduation, was unmistakable. The blue sleeve of his linen shirt was slightly pushed back. They hadn't just started working together last week. This had been going on since the early summer, while I was painting the porch, while I was preparing dinners that grew cold on the stove, while I was waiting for him to come home from late inspections. I stood up, my knees making a small, dry popping sound in the quiet room. I didn't feel the sudden hot rush of anger. That is for women who still believe they have something to lose. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity. It was the same feeling you get when a long, heavy storm finally breaks and you can see exactly how much of the roof has rotted away. I took the printed bank statements, folded them neatly, and slid them into the bottom of the old cedar chest in the hallway, beneath the hand-knit blankets my grandmother had made for my wedding. At 1 o'clock, Joanne returned. She was in a rush, as always, her mind already on the next task. "Was she good?" Joanne asked, hoisting the diaper bag onto her shoulder while Maisie rubbed her sleepy eyes. "She was perfect," I said, kissing Maisie's warm cheek. "You're a lifesaver, Mom. Seriously, I don't know what we'd do without you." Joanne paused at the door, her eyes lingering on my face for a second. "You still look really tired, Gail. Maybe you should take a bath or something. Have Warren take you out to dinner." "We went out last night, Joanne," I said. "Oh, right." She smiled, a quick, empty gesture. "Well, do it again. You deserve it." After they left, the silence of the house settled back down like dust. Warren came home at 7:30. He didn't bring the smell of Lancaster dirt or construction dust with him. He smelled of rain, leather, and a faint hint of wood smoke. In his hand, he carried a paper bag from the Thai restaurant downtown. "Thought I'd give you a break tonight," he said, setting the bag on the counter. He offered a quick, pleasant smile, the kind of smile he used to give clients when he was about to deliver bad news about their budget. "I know things were a little tense yesterday. I want to move past it." "Thank you," I said, setting out 2 plates. We ate at the kitchen island. Warren was unusually talkative. He spoke about his Lancaster client, a wealthy developer who wanted to build a series of high-end cabins, with an artificial enthusiasm that made his voice sound hollow. "The market is changing, Gail," he said, using his chopsticks to point at his plate. "People want small, luxury spaces. They don't want these big, sprawling suburban homes anymore. They're too much work, too much upkeep." "Are they?" "Absolutely," he said, leaning forward. "Actually, I was looking at our property tax assessment today. It's gone up again. And the gutters are starting to sag on the west side. The roof is going to need $15,000 of work next year, easy. It's a lot for us to manage." I kept my eyes on my plate. "We've lived here for 22 years, Warren." "Exactly, and we're not getting any younger," he said, his voice dropping into a reasonable, patronizing tone. "You spend half your summer weeding those gardens, and for what? My back is stiff every time I mow the lawn. I've been thinking, maybe we should look into downsizing. Sell this place while the market is hot." The pieces of the structure were falling into place now. Our home was fully paid off. We had cleared the mortgage 5 years ago. In today's market, the house was worth at least $650,000. If we sold it, half of that equity would belong to him. $325,000, enough to fund his brighter elevations with Marin, enough to pay for more than just website design and silk scarves, enough to buy a new life, free of the woman who had helped him build the old one. "A condo near the course," he continued, watching me closely. "No yard work, no maintenance, everything brand new. It would be much easier for you, Gail. You wouldn't have so much space to clean." He thought I was simple. He thought that because I had spent 30 years agreeing to his decisions, I had lost the capacity to understand them. He saw my silence as compliance, my endurance as a lack of options. I looked at him. I looked at the small graying hairs in his eyebrows, the soft skin beneath his chin, and the silver watch on his wrist. "A condo sounds very quiet, Warren," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any anger. He blinked, a flash of relief washing over his face so quickly he didn't even try to hide it. He hadn't expected it to be this easy. He had probably spent the drive home from Lancaster rehearsing his arguments, preparing for a fight I wasn't going to give him. "It would be," he said, his smile widening, becoming genuine for the first time in days. "It would be perfect for us. I can call a real estate agent tomorrow, just to get an appraisal. No pressure, of course." "Of course," I said. "Let's see what it's worth." He reached out, his hand covering mine where it sat on the granite counter. His palm was warm, dry, and entirely empty of any real warmth. "I'm glad we're on the same page, Gail," he said. "So am I, Warren," I said. I left my hand beneath his, not pulling away, but not pressing back either. I let him hold a shape that was already gone. Denise Klink was the kind of real estate agent who treated every home like a patient in need of cosmetic surgery. She arrived on Friday morning, her high heels clicking sharply on our concrete driveway, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with gold letters. Warren was waiting for her at the front door, his posture upright, his face wearing the eager, pleasant expression of a man about to cash a winning ticket. "Denise, thank you for coming out on such short notice," he said, shaking her hand with an excess of energy. "This is my wife, Gail." Denise gave me a tight, professional smile. Her eyes did a quick, practiced calculation of my linen trousers, my lack of makeup, and the silver-threaded hair I hadn't bothered to style. "Pleasure to meet you, Gail. It's a lovely property. Excellent bones." We walked through the house. I stayed 3 steps behind them, a ghost touring her own life. "Now the kitchen," Denise said, touching the edge of the granite island. "The cabinets are solid oak, which is great, but the cathedral arch on the doors is very 94. Buyers today want flat panel, white or charcoal. And this granite, it's too busy. People want clean, white quartz." "Of course," Warren said, nodding vigorously. "We can paint the cabinets or offer a credit for remodeling, whatever makes the transition smoother." "And the trim," Denise added, gesturing to the thick pine baseboards that ran along the hallway. Baseboards Warren and I had stained together on our living room floor, our hands covered in dark walnut oil, while a young Wesley slept in his playpen. "It makes the rooms feel smaller. If we paint it white, the space will open up. Modern buyers hate natural wood, unless it's reclaimed barn board." "I can do that," Warren said immediately. "I've got some leftover white primer in the garage. I can knock that out over the weekend." He was willing to paint over our history with cheap white primer if it meant getting the listing active. He didn't see the wood. He saw the equity. He didn't see the 30 years of quiet, meticulous care I had given to those baseboards, keeping them free of scuffs and dust, treating the pine every spring so it wouldn't dry out and crack. When a house is put up for sale, strangers walk through your bedrooms and touch your countertops, calculating the cost of your life in square footage. They don't see the silent tears shed in the hallway after a hard phone call, or the years of invisible labor that kept the floorboards from warping. To them, it is just a box of debt waiting to be transferred. With a few cosmetic updates, painting the wood, replacing the brass fixtures, maybe staging this living room with some lighter furniture, we can list at $680,000, Denise said, sliding her tablet into her portfolio. "In this neighborhood, it'll sell in a weekend." 680, Warren repeated, his voice hushed, a small, hungry light appearing in his eyes. That's excellent." "I'll put together the paperwork and email it over," Denise said, turning to me with a polite, dismissive nod. "It's a big step, Gail, but you'll love the condo life. No more gardens to worry about." "Yes," I said quietly, "no more gardens." An hour later, Warren left for a meeting with a supplier in Westchester. The moment his car cleared the driveway, I went to the cedar chest, retrieved the envelope of printed bank statements, and drove to a small brick office building in Media, Pennsylvania. The sign on the door read, "Monica Vance, Family Law." Monica was 62, with sharp, graying hair cut into a sensible bob and reading glasses that hung from a silver chain around her neck. Her office smelled of old paper, lavender tea, and the quiet, heavy residue of other people's broken promises. She didn't offer me pity. She offered me a seat, took the folder from my hands, and began to read. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the dry rustle of paper as she turned the pages of our bank statements. She used a yellow highlighter to mark the transfers, the $12,000 for professional services, the boutique charge, and the $10,000 moved from our joint retirement savings. "He's draining your marital assets to fund his LLC," Monica said, sliding her glasses down her nose to look at me. And then he's using the LLC to pay Marin's design firm. It's a very common pattern, Gail. He thinks because the LLC is in his name, the money belongs to him. He's wrong. He wants to sell the house, I said. He wants to downsize. Monica let out a short, dry sound that was almost a laugh. Of course he does. The house is paid off. If he sells it now, $340,000 of that equity goes straight into his pocket, or more likely, into his LLC's accounts, where he thinks you can't touch it. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished oak of her desk. Here is the reality, Gail. The house is marital property. He cannot sell it without your signature on the deed and the closing documents. If you refuse to sign, the sale cannot happen. I know, I said, but if I refuse, he'll know I've found him out. He'll stop moving the money where we can track it. Monica's eyes sharpened. A slow, appreciative smile touched the corners of her mouth. You've been paying attention. I've watched him build things for 30 years, Monica, I said. I know how he handles a structure. He doesn't look at the foundation until the walls start to lean. Exactly, Monica said, tapping her pen against the desk. So we don't stop him. Let him call the real estate agent. Let him list the house. Let him spend his own time and money painting the trim and fixing the gutters. The more he thinks you're going along with his plan, the more careless he will become. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. In the meantime, I'm going to petition for a forensic audit of his business accounts. We're going to trace every dollar that went to Marin's firm. If he paid for her travel, her meals, or that boutique item out of marital funds, the court will credit that back to your share of the estate during the division. She looked at me, her expression serious. But you have to hold your ground, Gail. He's going to pressure you to sign a listing agreement soon. When he does, you tell him you want your attorney to review it first. Or better yet, tell him you want to wait until after his Savannah conference in November so you can focus on the packing. November, I said. Yes, that's 3 weeks away. Let him go to Savannah, Monica said, her voice cold, steady. Let him spend the money. Every dollar he spends on her is another dollar the judge will take out of his half of the house. When I returned home, the garage door was open. Warren's sedan was parked inside, but he wasn't in the house. I walked quietly across the lawn toward the side entrance of the garage. Through the small window, I could see him sitting in the driver's seat of his car. The door was slightly ajar, his phone pressed to his ear. His face was flushed, his head tilted back against the leather headrest. He was laughing, that soft, breathless laugh I hadn't heard since we were in our 20s, living in a cramped apartment where we could barely afford the rent. No, she doesn't suspect a thing, he was saying, his voice low, intimate. She's actually on board with the sale. Denise came out today and gave us a great number. Once we close, we'll have the capital we need for the Lancaster project. And Savannah? Yes, I've booked the room, the one with the working fireplace. I can't wait to see you in that green pendant. He paused, listening, a soft, foolish smile spreading across his face. I know, he murmured. I know. Soon. Just a few more weeks, Marin. I stood in the shadow of the garage wall, the cold autumn wind blowing dry maple leaves across my shoes. I didn't feel my heart break. The break had happened years ago, so slowly and quietly that I hadn't even noticed the pieces falling away. Now there was only the structure left, and I was finally ready to take my hands off the walls. On Saturday morning, Warren began the work of erasing our past. He wore a faded pair of denim overalls and an old T-shirt from a construction job he'd finished in the late 90s. He had set up a bright halogen work light in the hallway, its harsh white glare throwing every small detail of the pine baseboards into sharp relief. I stood at the end of the hall, holding a basket of clean laundry, watching him apply the blue painter's tape along the edge of the hardwood floor. His 60-year-old knees made a dry, cracking sound every time he shifted his weight. "You should open the windows, Warren," I said. "The primer is going to smell." "It's low VOC," he grunted, not looking up. "It doesn't smell that bad. And if I open the windows, the humidity will slow down the dry time. I want to get the first coat of semi-gloss on by tomorrow afternoon." I watched him open the can of white primer. He stirred it with a wooden slat, the thick, chalky liquid clinging to the pine like heavy cream. He dipped his brush and made the first long, smooth stroke across the natural wood. The dark, warm walnut stain we had chosen together 30 years ago disappeared beneath a layer of sterile white. "See," Warren said, pausing to look back at me over his shoulder, his face slick with sweat. "Denise was right. It instantly looks brighter, cleaner." "It looks very clean, Warren," I said. A man who wants to escape his past will work twice as hard to paint over it. He doesn't realize that under the fresh coat of white, the grain of the old wood remains, waiting for the moisture to seep back in and ruin his work. He believes that if he can make the surface look like a modern hotel room, the life he lived inside it will simply cease to exist. I walked down the hall to our bedroom, set the laundry basket on the bed, and began to fold his shirts. I folded them neatly, the way he liked, the sleeves tucked back, the collars aligned, stacking them into the suitcase he would take to Savannah in 2 weeks. My hands were steady. I was no longer a wife trying to save her marriage. I was an archivist, cataloging the final days of an old empire. By Sunday evening, the house smelled heavily of latex paint and roasted chicken. I had cooked a traditional Sunday dinner, keeping the routine intact. We sat at the dining table, the white-painted trim in the hallway glowing under the dim chandelier. Warren was exhausted, his hands slightly trembling as he held his fork, but he had a manic, satisfied energy. "Denise emailed the listing agreement this afternoon," he said, setting his water glass down. "She wants us to sign it tonight so she can put the coming soon sign in the yard tomorrow morning." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 folded sheets of paper, sliding them across the table toward me. A silver pen lay on top of them. "I've already signed my part," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes were locked on my face, watching for any sign of hesitation. "We just need your signature on the bottom of page 3. I picked up the papers. The print was small, a dense thicket of legal terms regarding commissions, listing periods, and dual agency representation. My eyes slid down to his signature, Warren Curtis, written in his bold, blocky hand. Beside it was the empty line for my name. "I'd like to hold off on listing it actively until you get back from Georgia, Warren," I said, setting the papers down next to my plate. His smile faltered, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Why? The market is hot right now, Gail. Every week we wait is a week we're losing buyers. If we list it tomorrow, Denise will want to start showings immediately," I explained, my voice calm reasonable, matching the tone I had practiced in my head all afternoon. "You're going to be in Savannah for 5 days. My hip has been acting up with the cold, damp weather, and I can't manage the cleaning and the prep for random buyers coming through the house while you're away. And I want to read over the section about the broker's fee. 5% seems high for this neighborhood." 5% is standard, he said, his voice rising slightly, the pleasant veneer beginning to crack. "And Denise is going to handle the staging. You won't have to do anything." "I still have to live here, Warren," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "I don't want strangers walking through our bedroom while I'm here alone. Let's sign it the day you get back. It's only a 2-week delay." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He wanted to push me, to demand that I sign it now, but he was afraid of making me suspicious. He didn't want to jeopardize the easy compliance he thought he had secured. "Fine," he said, pulling the papers back toward his side of the table with a sharp, irritated movement. "We wait until I get back. But the day I return, we sign. No more delays, Gail. I've already committed to the condo developer." "I understand," I said. "We'll sign when you get back." Later that evening, after Warren had gone upstairs to take a hot bath to soothe his aching shoulders, I went down the driveway to collect the Sunday mail. The air was freezing now, the wind carrying the scent of wood smoke from our neighbor's chimney. The dry leaves of our maple tree scraped against the asphalt like small claws. Inside the mailbox, nestled between a local grocery circular and a utility bill, was a thick, white, windowed envelope. It was addressed to Warren Curtis, Westchester Consulting, LLC. It was from Apex Commercial Funding. I didn't open it at the mailbox. I walked back to the house, entered through the mudroom, and sat at my small desk in the kitchen. Using a thin letter opener, I slid the blade under the seal, taking care not to tear the paper. It was a pre-approval letter for a commercial lease at 412 Maple Lane, a trendy, high-end address in the historic district of Westchester. But it was the second page that made my breath catch in my throat. Personal guarantee and asset verification. Warren had applied for a commercial line of credit to secure the 5-year lease on Marin's new design studio. To get the funding, he had listed our home, our fully paid-off, unencumbered home, as the primary collateral to back his personal guarantee. The document stated that the deed had been verified as free of liens and that, upon final closing of the residential property sale, the proceeds will be used to clear the initial lease deposit and secure the commercial line of credit. He hadn't just planned to split the equity of our home to start a new life. He had already pledged the entire structure to fund Marin's business, confident that I would sign the deed over to him without ever reading the fine print. If the business failed, or if he walked away, the lenders would come for the house. My share, my security, my 30 years of quiet, careful saving. I sat in the dim kitchen, the paper rattling slightly between my fingers. From upstairs, I heard the sound of the bathwater draining, followed by Warren's heavy, slow footsteps crossing the bedroom floor. I carefully slid the document back into the envelope, applied a tiny smear of glue to the torn seal, and placed it back on his desk in the study, exactly where he would expect to find the mail tomorrow morning. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went to the hallway chest, pulled out my grandmother's blanket, and lay down on the sofa in the living room, listening to the white-painted walls of our house hold their breath in the dark. On Monday morning, Warren found me on the sofa. He came down the stairs at 6:30, dressed in his clean khakis and a blue button-down shirt, smelling of his expensive pine-scented soap. He paused at the bottom of the steps, his brow furrowing slightly as he saw me folded beneath my grandmother's knit blanket. "Gail, what are you doing down here?" "The paint fumes," I said, my voice dry. I sat up slowly, rubbing my lower back. My chest was tight last night, and my hip was throbbing. It was easier to hold still on the sofa. He didn't step into the living room to touch my shoulder or offer me a hand to help me up. He simply nodded, his eyes already drifting toward the kitchen counter where his tablet sat. "Yeah, that semi-gloss is strong," he said, walking past me. "I'll open the kitchen windows before I leave. You should take some ibuprofen." I watched him walk into his study. I stood up, folding the blanket carefully, keeping my movements silent. Through the open door of the study, I saw him pick up the stack of mail from his desk. He sorted through it quickly, circulars, a water bill, until he reached the thick white envelope from Apex Commercial Funding. I watched his face through the door frame. There was a brief, tense pause as his thumb slid under the glued seal. He pulled out the letter, his eyes scanning the pages. A slow, subtle wave of relief passed over his features. The slight relaxing of his shoulders, the small, satisfied nod he gave to the empty room. He folded the paper, opened the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, and locked it inside. He slid the keyring back into his pocket, entirely unaware that the screen of my phone, sitting on the kitchen counter, already held a perfect, high-resolution photograph of every word he had just read. A thief is always most polite when he believes his hands are still hidden in your pockets. When he came out of the study, he looked at me with a warmth that felt entirely foreign. "I'm heading out to the Lancaster site," he said, reaching for his car keys. "Don't worry about dinner tonight, Gail. I'll pick up some of that soup you like from the market on my way back. Just rest that hip." "Thank you, Warren," I said. "Have a safe drive." By 11 o'clock, I was sitting in Monica Vance's office in media. The gray autumn rain was tapping against her window, a steady rhythmic sound that matched the ticking of the grandfather clock in her corner. Monica sat with her reading glasses slid down her nose, staring at my phone as she scrolled through the photographs of the Apex Commercial Funding document. "This is highly reckless," Monica said, her voice dropping into a low, hard register. "Pledging a fully paid-off marital home as a personal guarantee for a commercial lease without your signature or knowledge? If he had tried to finalize this lease before the house sold, it would have been mortgage fraud. But because the document states the funding is contingent on the sale of the home, he's technically positioned himself to use his share of the proceeds to clear the debt immediately." "And my share?" I asked. "If you sign that listing agreement and the house sells, the escrow company splits the proceeds 50-50, Monica explained, leaning back in her leather chair. "But if he's already signed a personal guarantee using the home as collateral, The commercial lenders can place a lien on his portion of the proceeds. He'll walk away with his debt cleared and a new studio for Marin. You'll walk away with half of what's left, which won't be enough to buy a condo, let alone support you through retirement. She looked at me, her sharp eyes studying my face. He's counting on your ignorance, Gail. He spent 30 years watching you manage the household budget, and he's decided you don't understand high-level finance. He thinks you're just a quiet woman who does what she's told. I've let him think that, I said. It was easier than fighting. Well, his ease is about to end, Monica said, a cold, dry smile touching her lips. He leaves for Savannah on November 12th, correct? Yes, a Tuesday. Good. Here is what we're going to do. We're going to let him go. Let him check into the Gastonian. Let him order his expensive dinners with Marin. On Wednesday morning, while he is hundreds of miles away, we are going to file the divorce petition. She tapped her finger on the desk. The moment we file, I will place a lis pendens on your home. It's a formal notice of pending litigation. Legally, it acts as a red flag on the property's title. Once that is filed, Denise cannot sell the house. No escrow company will touch it, and no buyer can secure a mortgage on it. And the commercial funding, I asked? The underwriters at Apex Commercial will run a final credit and title check before releasing the funds for his lease, Monica said. The second they see a pending divorce and a lis pendens on the primary collateral, they will freeze his commercial loan. The lease on Marin's new studio will collapse in real time while he is sitting in Georgia. She leaned forward, her expression turning deeply human, free of the professional distance she usually maintained. It's going to be loud, Gail. When he realizes what you've done, he's going to call. He's going to scream. He's going to try to convince you that he was doing all of this for us. Are you ready for that? I looked down at my hands. The skin was pale, the knuckles slightly swollen from years of gardening, baking, and scrubbing. For 30 years, I had held the walls of our life together, believing that if I kept the house clean enough, quiet enough, and warm enough, it would eventually feel like a home. But a house is just wood and stone. If the man inside it is spending his days planning your erasure, there is nothing left to hold up. I'm ready, Monica, I said. I've been ready for a long time. I left the attorney's office and drove to the grocery store. The rain had turned into a cold, heavy drizzle that clung to the windshield. I walked through the aisles of the supermarket, picking out a butternut squash, some sage, and a carton of heavy cream. I wanted to make a soup for Warren. I wanted the house to smell warm and welcoming when he returned. I wanted him to feel completely safe. As I stood in the checkout line, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Warren. Saw some nice 2-bedroom units at the Fairway Villas online, it read. I think you'll love the master bath. We can start fresh, Gail. I want you to have a comfortable retirement. Looking forward to the soup tonight. I stared at the screen. The clerk was scanning my squash, the register making a bright, repetitive beep. We can start fresh. He was still wearing the mask of the caring husband, offering me a comfortable retirement in a sterile condo, while he prepared to hand our life savings to a 32-year-old designer. He wanted me to feel grateful for the crumbs he was planning to leave behind. I typed my reply with steady fingers. Thank you, Warren. It sounds lovely. The soup will be hot when you get home." The butternut squash soup was thick, sweet, and smelled of fried sage. Warren ate 2 bowls of it at the kitchen island, his posture relaxed, his coat draped over the back of the bar stool. The rain outside had turned the windows into dark, weeping sheets of glass. But inside, the kitchen was warm, insulated by the heavy aroma of roasted garlic and yeast from the bread I had baked. "This is incredible, Gail," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Seriously, you haven't made this in years." "You said it was too heavy the last time I made it," I replied, standing by the stove, slowly wiping down the stainless steel burners. "Well, I was wrong," he said easily. He reached for his tablet, tapping the screen to open an image gallery. "Here, look at this. I wanted to show you the floor plan of the Fairway Villas. The agent sent it over this afternoon." He turned the tablet toward me. The screen showed a glossy, 3-dimensional rendering of a living room with gray vinyl plank flooring, a gas fireplace with a faux stone mantel, and a tiny, square concrete patio looking out over a manicured golf green. It was a space designed for survival, not for living. It had no workshops, no deep gardens, and no history. "It has a walk-in shower in the master," Warren said, his finger tapping the screen to zoom in on the bathroom. "No tub to climb over, much safer for your hip. And they handle all the snow removal and lawn care. We won't have to lift a finger." "It looks very efficient, Warren," I said, coming over to look at the screen. "It's about simplicity, Gail," he said, his voice warm, dripping with that gentle, condescending concern he had perfected over the last few weeks. "We've spent our lives maintaining structures. It's time we let someone else do the heavy lifting. You deserve to rest." The most dangerous moment in a betrayal is not when the betrayer is angry, but when they are kind. That is when they are most convinced of their own righteousness. Warren didn't see himself as a man who was stealing his wife's security to buy a younger woman's attention. In his mind, he was performing an act of mercy. He was quietly tucking his aging wife into a safe, manageable corner where she wouldn't be a burden to his new life, and he expected me to thank him for the comfortable retirement he was so generously arranging. "I'm glad you're thinking of my comfort," I said, looking from the screen to his eyes. "Always," he said, reaching out to pat my arm. "We've had a good run here, but it's time for a fresh start." 6 days passed in a quiet, tense simulation of a normal marriage. By Sunday afternoon, November 10th, the house had grown cold. A hard frost had killed the remaining hydrangeas in the front yard, leaving their heads dry, brown, and rattling in the autumn wind. Warren's trip to Savannah was 36 hours away. He was in our bedroom, packing. The bed was covered in his linen shirts, his light-colored trousers, and the charcoal gray blazer he had purchased for the dinner meetings. He was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice muffled as he spoke to someone on the other end. "Yes, I have the drafts," he said, his voice dropping as he paced near the closet. "I'll bring them with me. No, she doesn't suspect a thing. We're on schedule." I stood on the landing, holding a stack of his freshly ironed dress shirts. I waited until I heard the click of his phone hanging up before I knocked gently on the open door. "I have your shirts, Warren," I said, stepping into the room. "Thanks, just put them on the chair," he said. He was flushed, his eyes slightly bright, his mind clearly already in Georgia. "I'm almost done. Just need to pack my toiletries." He grabbed his leather shaving kit and walked into the master bathroom, leaving his garment bag open on the bed. I set the shirts down. My eyes immediately fell on his charcoal blazer, which was draped over the valet stand near the window. The inside pocket was slightly heavy, the fabric sagging forward. I stepped quickly to the valet stand. My movements were silent, practiced through 3 decades of tidying up after him. I reached into the inside pocket of the blazer. My fingers closed around a folded, legal-sized document. I pulled it out and opened it quickly, my eyes scanning the text. Transfer of membership interest, Westchester Consulting, LLC. The document was dated November 13th, the day after he arrived in Savannah. It was a formal agreement transferring 49% of the voting shares and 50% of all future financial distributions of his consulting firm to Marin Keller, LLC, for the sum of $1 and other valuable considerations. He wasn't just using his LLC to pay her consulting fees. He was giving her half of the company itself. By doing this before any divorce was filed, he was attempting to dilute the value of his business so that when the assets were eventually divided, there would be half as much for the court to award to me. He was stripping his own company to the bone, transferring the meat to Marin under the guise of a partnership agreement, confident that I would never think to look at the business registry. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. I took 3 clear, high-resolution photographs of the document: the first page, the distribution schedule, and the signature page where Marin's name was already typed next to a blank line. I folded the paper, slid it back into the inside pocket of the blazer, and stepped back to the bed just as the bathroom door opened. Warren walked out, holding his shaving kit. He stopped when he saw me standing near the valet stand. His eyes darted instantly to the charcoal blazer, then to my face. The pleasant, relaxed expression he had been wearing for the last week vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp hostility. He stepped forward quickly, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor, and grabbed the blazer off the valet stand with a rough, jerking motion. "I told you I've got this, Gail," he said, his voice tight, his eyes dark with a sudden anxious anger. "I can pack my own clothes." "There was some lint on the shoulder, Warren," I said, my voice soft, entirely devoid of defense. "I was just brushing it off." He stared at me, his chest rising and falling with shallow, quick breaths. He was looking at me not as his wife of 30 years, but as a potential threat, an obstacle that had to be managed, a lock that had to be kept secure. "I don't need you going through my pockets," he snapped, his voice cold, defensive. "I'm 60 years old. I think I can manage my own packing without you hovering over me." "Of course, Warren," I said. I stepped back toward the doorway, offering him a small, apologetic smile. "I'll leave you to it." I walked down the stairs, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The mask had slipped, if only for a second, revealing the panic of a man who knew he was building his new life on a foundation of sand. 36 hours. I went to the kitchen, opened my laptop, and sent the photographs of the transfer agreement to Monica Vance. On Monday night, Warren tried to mend the tear he had made. We sat in the living room under the yellow glow of the standing lamp. The house was quiet, save for the dry, rhythmic clicking of the baseboard heaters. Warren had poured himself a small glass of bourbon, and he was looking at me with a soft, apologetic expression that felt as practiced as a theater performance. "I'm sorry I was sharp with you yesterday, Gail," he said, turning the glass in his hands. "The preparations for this conference have me on edge. There's a lot riding on this Lancaster deal, and Marin's team has been pushing me for the final LLC restructuring. I shouldn't have taken it out on you." "It's all right, Warren," I said, my knitting needles clicking softly as I worked on a gray wool scarf I would never finish. "You've always been protective of your work." "It's not just work," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping into that warm, reasonable register. "It's our future. Everything I'm doing right now, the consulting, the website, even selling this house, it's all so we can have some peace. I don't want you to think I'm just brushing you aside." He reached into his pocket and slid a small stack of bills onto the coffee table between us. "Here's $500, he said, "for groceries or if you want to get your hair done while I'm gone. Take care of yourself, Gail. Don't spend the whole week worrying about the house." I looked at the green paper on the dark mahogany of the table. When a person is about to leave you, they often look at you with a strange, nostalgic fondness. They are not mourning the loss of your presence. They are celebrating their own escape, treating you like a monument they are passing on their way out of town. Warren wanted to leave me with a pocket full of grocery money so he could feel like a good provider while he flew south to give half of his life to another woman. He wanted his guilt to be cheap. "Thank you, Warren," I said. "I'll make sure to use it." On Tuesday morning, November 12th, the alarm went off at 4:30. The house was freezing, the air smelling of the frost that had settled thick over the lawn. I stayed in bed, watching him move through the dark bedroom in his gray wool coat. He checked his watch, picked up his leather garment bag and his suitcase, and turned to look at me where I lay beneath the heavy blankets. "I'm heading out," he whispered, leaning down to press a dry, brief kiss to my cheek. "The flight is at 7. I'll call you when I check into the hotel." "Have a safe flight, Warren," I said. I heard his heavy boots on the stairs, the click of the front door, and then the low, rumbling start of his sedan in the driveway. I got out of bed and stood by the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. The red taillights of his car cut through the dark, icy fog as he backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel before turning onto the main road. The red glow faded into the mist, and then he was gone. The silence that settled over the house was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of his presence. It was the vast, clean silence of an empty space. At 8:30, I dressed in a dark wool coat and drove to the Westchester Trust Bank. The teller, an older woman named Teresa, who had helped me with our mortgage payments 20 years ago, smiled warmly when I walked up to her counter. "Morning, Gail. Cold one today, isn't it?" "It is, Teresa," I said, sliding my ID and my joint savings debit card across the marble counter. "I'd like to make a withdrawal from our savings account, please." "Of course," she said, her fingers moving over the keyboard. "How much are we looking at today?" $42,500, I said. Teresa's fingers paused. She looked up, her eyes wide, a professional concern registering on her face. That's nearly the entire balance, Gail. We'll need to issue a cashier's check for that amount, and there's a small processing form." "That's fine," I said, my voice steady. "My husband and I are preparing for some renovations on the property, And we need to clear the joint account to transfer the funds to the contractor." "I see," Teresa said, her face relaxing as she accepted the explanation. "Just give me a moment to prepare the paperwork." 10 minutes later, I walked out of the bank with a cashier's check for $42,500, exactly 50% of our liquid personal savings, down to the penny. I did not touch his business account, and I did not take a single dollar of his LLC funds. Monica Vance had been very clear. We must keep my hands completely clean. The court must see me not as a vindictive wife trying to ruin her husband, but as a practical partner securing her half of the marital estate before it could be spent on silk scarves and Savannah hotels. By noon, I was back at the house, standing in the kitchen, when my phone began to ring. I looked at the screen. It was Wesley. I let it ring twice before I picked it up. "Hello, Wesley." "Mom, what is going on?" His voice was loud, hurried, and sharp, with an irritation he didn't try to hide. "Joanne just called me. She said Dad texted her and said you guys are listing the house next week? That you're moving to some condo?" "We've been discussing it, yes," I said, setting my car keys on the counter. "Discussing it? You can't just sell the house, Mom," Wesley snapped. I could hear the sound of traffic in the background. He was driving, likely on his way between sales meetings. "Where are we supposed to spend holidays? What about Maisie's room? We've been planning to use your garage to store our patio furniture for the winter. You can't just downsize without talking to us first." "Your father feels the maintenance is too much for us, Wesley," I said, keeping my voice flat, holding the phone away from my ear slightly. "Then let me help with the maintenance. I can come mow the lawn once a month," he said, though we both knew he hadn't touched our lawnmower in 5 years. "This is ridiculous, Mom. Dad retirement planning is one thing, but you guys are just giving up on the family home. It's like you don't even care about the memories here." The memories. He saw our home not as the place where his mother had spent 30 years washing his clothes, cooking his meals, and smoothing over his father's temper, but as a free storage unit and a convenient backdrop for his Thanksgiving dinners. He wanted the structure to remain exactly as it was, holding up his life, while I continued to clean the rooms in silence. "We'll talk about it when your father gets back, Wesley," I said. "Yeah, well, I'm going to call him," Wesley said, his voice tight. "He needs to explain why this is happening so fast. I'll talk to you later." He hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone on the counter and looked at the white-painted baseboards in the hallway. I didn't call Warren to warn him, and I didn't call Wesley back. I went upstairs, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and began to pack the things that actually belonged to me. I spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon sorting through our life. It is a strange thing to look at 30 years of accumulation through the lens of departure. I didn't touch the heavy oak furniture Warren had bought to show off his success, nor did I touch the expensive brass lamps or the leather armchairs. I went for the drawers, the boxes, and the small hidden corners where the actual history of our family was kept. I opened the old wooden cedar chest in the hallway. From the bottom, beneath the wool blankets, I pulled out 3 leather-bound photo albums. As I turned the pages, I realized something I had never noticed before. I was barely in any of them. There were dozens of photos of Wesley and our daughter-in-law Joanne. There were photos of Warren standing proudly in front of his completed commercial projects, his hand resting on the hood of his truck. But of me, there were only 3 or 4, usually taken from a distance, my face partially shadowed by a sun hat, or my hands busy serving food at a backyard barbecue. A mother's face is often missing from the family history, because she was the one behind the lens. She was too busy capturing the happiness of others to stand inside it. I had been the invisible recorder of their lives, and when I stopped taking the pictures, it would be as if I had never been there at all. I took the albums, my grandmother's quilt, and a small silver jewelry box my mother had given me when I turned 18. Inside were my modest silver rings and a pair of pearl earrings Warren had bought me during our first year of marriage, back when he still looked at me when I spoke. I packed these few things into 2 cardboard boxes and carried them out to the trunk of my car. I didn't want him to return to a house that looked empty. I wanted the structure to look exactly the same, neat, clean, and perfectly maintained, so he would have no reason to suspect that the foundation had already been removed. When a woman finally decides to leave a home, she doesn't pack the furniture. She packs the proof that she existed inside it. She takes the small, quiet things that survived the decades of neglect, leaving the rest to the dust and the people who never truly saw her anyway. At 8:30 that evening, the phone on the kitchen counter began to ring. I was sitting at the island, drinking a cup of chamomile tea, watching the dark rain run down the window. I picked it up. "Hello, Warren." "Hey, Gail," his voice came through the line, warm, expansive, and floating on a wave of easy confidence. In the background, I could hear the faint, ambient sounds of Savannah, the distant tolling of a church bell, the rustle of wind through Spanish moss, and the low, muffled laughter of a woman before the phone was suddenly adjusted. "Just wanted to let you know I made it. Checked into the Gastonian about an hour ago. The room is incredible." "Is it?" I asked, holding the tea mug warm against my palms. "How is the weather?" "Warm," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his breathing. "Smells like jasmine and old brick down here. Much better than the frost back home. The conference registration starts tomorrow morning at 9. It's going to be a busy few days, but I think the networking is going to pay off big." "I'm glad, Warren. You've put a lot of energy into this." "I have," he agreed, his voice dropping into that serious, self-important tone he used when he wanted to emphasize his own sacrifices. "I'm doing this for us, Gail. I know the house sale is a lot to digest, but once I finalize a few things down here, we're going to be in a much better place. I'll have some big news when I get back on Sunday." "Will you?" "Yeah, some big leaps for the business," he said. "Mirren's been working on the final partnership drafts all evening. We're going to finalize the restructure tomorrow afternoon over dinner." He was telling me the truth, but it was a truth wrapped in a lie. He was going to finalize the transfer of 49% of his company to his mistress, and he was calling his wife to tell her it was for us. He was so confident in my compliance, so certain of my ignorance, that he didn't even feel the need to hide the timeline. "Well, enjoy your dinner, Warren," I said, my voice steady, empty of any tremor, "and enjoy the fireplace." There was a sudden, sharp silence on the other end of the line. The ambient sound of the Georgia night seemed to freeze. "What?" he asked, his voice tighter now, the warmth vanishing. "How did you know about the fireplace?" "You mentioned it when we were looking at historic hotels online last month," I said, my tone light, casual. "You said the Gastonian was famous for having working fireplaces in the rooms." I had never looked at historic hotels with him. I had found it in his private planner, but I knew he wouldn't remember what he had or hadn't told me. When a man is living two lives, the details of his lies eventually run together like wet ink. I heard him let out a slow, relieved breath. "Oh, right. Yes, I must have. Yes, there is a fireplace. It's very historic." "Get some rest, Warren," I said. "You have a big day tomorrow." "Thanks, Gail. You too. Take care of that hip. I'll call you tomorrow night." "Goodbye, Warren." I hung up the phone and set it face down on the granite counter. The kitchen was silent. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9 o'clock on Tuesday, November 12th. In exactly 12 hours, Monica Vance would walk into the county courthouse in Media and file the petition for divorce, accompanied by the list pendants on our home. By noon, the underwriters at Apex Commercial Funding would receive the notification of the freeze on the primary collateral. I took my tea mug to the sink, rinsed it, and turned off the kitchen lights. As I walked up the dark stairs, I felt no fear, no regret, and no anger. I felt only the deep, cool weight of a woman who had finally stopped holding up a roof that had been built to crush her. On Wednesday morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Media damp and reflecting the cold white sky. I sat in Monica Vance's office at 9:30. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit, and she had a fresh pot of black tea sitting on the low table between us. She didn't look tired. She looked energized, the way a seasoned builder looks when the scaffolding is finally taken down to reveal the structure. She slid 2 stapled documents across the table toward me. They were stamped with blue ink at the top right corner. Court of Common Pleas, Delaware County. Filed November 13th, 9:15 a.m. "It's done, Gail," Monica said, pouring a stream of dark tea into my cup. "The divorce petition has been officially recorded, and the lis pendens is active on the deed of your home. Legally, the house is frozen. No one can buy it, sell it, or use it as collateral until a judge signs off on the property division." "And Warren?" I asked, my hands steady as I picked up the warm cup. "A private process server in Savannah has been dispatched," Monica said, checking her watch. "The Gastonian has a courtyard where guests have lunch. The server has Warren's photo, his car registration, and his room number. He'll be served with the divorce papers and a temporary injunction freezing his business accounts at exactly 1:30 this afternoon. A legal document is just paper, but when it is stamped by a court, it becomes a wall. It is the moment the law steps into the private rooms of your life and says, you cannot pretend anymore. For 30 years, Warren had been the one who signed the contracts, who approved the plans, and who decided what was built and what was torn down. For the first time in his life, he was about to receive a structure he had no hand in designing. I returned to the house at 11. The air inside smelled of the white paint Warren had applied to the baseboards over the weekend, a sterile chemical scent that had not yet faded. I sat at the kitchen island, not turning on any lights, watching the pale autumn sun move across the granite counter. At 11:40, the kitchen phone rang. I looked at the caller ID. Denise Klink. I picked it up. "Hello, Denise." "Gail, thank goodness you're there." Denise's voice was hurried, her usual polished, professional tone replaced by a sharp, anxious vibration. "I'm calling because my assistant was uploading the listing documents to the MLS system, and the program flagged the deed. There's a title cloud, Gail. A lis pendens was recorded against your property at 9:15 this morning. Is there some mistake? Did a contractor place a lien?" "It's not a mistake, Denise," I said, my voice quiet, matching the silence of the kitchen. "The listing is canceled. The house is no longer for sale." "Canceled? But Warren said—" She paused, the professional gears in her head turning as she processed the term lis pendens. "Gail, is this a domestic matter?" "Thank you for your time, Denise," I said. "Please send the invoice for the appraisal and your time to our home address. I'll make sure it's paid." "Gail, wait! Does Warren know—" I hung up the phone. The silence returned, but it was shorter this time. At 1:42, my mobile phone on the counter began to vibrate. It slid an inch across the granite, its screen glowing with Warren's name. I let it ring, once, twice, 3 times. I wanted him to breathe. I wanted him to stand in the warm, jasmine-scented air of Georgia and feel the first cold draft of the house he had left behind. On the 4th ring, I answered. "Hello, Warren." There was no sound on the other end for a long, heavy 3 seconds. I could hear his breathing, shallow, ragged, and whistling slightly through his nose, the way he breathed when he was trying to control a sudden, violent temper. "Gail," he said. His voice was low, vibrating with a controlled, desperate fury that made the speaker rattle. "What did you do?" "I withdrew half of our savings, Warren," I said, my tone flat, conversational. "Exactly $42,500. I left your business account untouched." "No, not just the money," he hissed, his voice rising, the polished, confident tone of the Savannah consultant completely gone. "I just got a call from the underwriters at Apex. They're freezing the commercial lease application for the Westchester space. They said there's a litigation notice on our residential deed. They said my personal guarantee is worthless. Why is there a lawsuit on our house, Gail? Who sued us?" "No one sued us, Warren," I said, leaning back against the kitchen cabinets. "I filed for divorce this morning. The litigation notice is a lis pendens. It means you cannot sell the house to fund Marin's studio, and you cannot use our home as collateral for your new life." There was a sharp gasp on the other end of the line, the sound of a man who had just been struck in the chest. I heard a distant rustle of papers, the creak of a heavy wooden door, and then the sound of Warren's boots on the brick courtyard of the Gastonian. "You're out of your mind," he whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. "You're ruining everything. I'm doing this for us. I'm building a business so we can survive. You don't know what you're doing, Gail. You're a housewife. You don't understand how these things work." "I understand exactly how they work, Warren," I said. "I understand that you were going to transfer 49% of your LLC to Marin today over dinner. I understand that you used our paid-off home to secure her commercial lease. And I understand that you wanted to leave me in a gray condo with nothing but $500 of grocery money while you started fresh. The silence on the line was absolute now. The ambient sounds of Savannah seemed to vanish. He was standing in the warm southern sun, holding a phone, realizing that the quiet, compliant woman he had left in Pennsylvania had been watching him through the glass for months. "Warren?" A woman's voice came through the line, distant but clear. It was Marin. "Is everything okay? The front desk clerk is here. He says someone is looking for you." I smiled into the empty kitchen. "You should go, Warren," I said softly. "I believe someone has some paperwork to deliver to you. Enjoy your fireplace." I hung up. The phone call from Wesley came exactly 20 minutes later. I was standing in our bedroom, looking at the closet where Warren's suits had hung for 22 years. The empty wooden hangers rattled slightly against each other as the draft from the hallway window stirred the air. My phone vibrated in my palm. I picked it up. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" Wesley's voice was no longer just irritated. It was raw, loud, and shaking with a mixture of shock and anger. "Dad just called me from Georgia. He was hysterical, Mom. He was literally crying. He said you're divorcing him, that you filed papers this morning and had him served in public. Are you insane?" "I'm not insane, Wesley," I said, my voice quiet, contrasting the static heat of his anger. "I'm protecting my share of the life I built." "Your share," Wesley shouted, and I could hear him pacing, his boots squeaking on what sounded like his office floor. "What about his? He's 60 years old, Mom. He retired 2 years ago, and he's been working his tail off to build this consulting firm so you guys can actually afford to live. Do you have any idea what this does to his credit, to his reputation? Apex just pulled his commercial line. The lease is gone." "The lease was for Marin Keller's design studio, Wesley," I said. The line went silent for a beat. I could hear Wesley's heavy breathing, the sound of his tongue clicking against his teeth as he tried to find his footing. "So what? She's his partner. She's the designer. It's a business arrangement. You're destroying a 30-year marriage and his entire career over a business partnership?" "He used our fully paid-off home, the home I spent 30 years maintaining, the home that was supposed to be my security, as a personal guarantee to secure her commercial lease," I said, my voice steady, slow, letting every word land like a heavy stone. "He was going to transfer 49% of his company to her today for $0. He was going to sell this house, put me in a condo, and use his half of the equity to clear her business debts. He didn't build this for us, Wesley. He built it for her." I don't believe you," Wesley said, but his voice had lost its sharp, aggressive edge. It was smaller now, hovering on the edge of a boy's panic when he realizes his father is not the hero he thought he was. "Dad wouldn't do that. He's practical. He's always been about the family." "When a family structure collapses, Wesley, the children rarely blame the father who laid the dynamite," I said softly. "They blame the mother who finally refused to carry the weight of the roof on her back. I've carried it for 30 years. I'm done." "Mom, wait!" "I'm leaving the house now, Wesley," I said. "I've rented a small carriage house in Chester County. If you need to reach me, you can call my cell. But do not call me to defend your father. I've heard his excuses for 30 years, and I don't need to hear them from you." I hung up. I carried my 2 boxes of photo albums and grandmother's blankets down the stairs. The house was cold now, the heating vents clicking in the quiet rooms. Before I left, I walked through the kitchen and down the hallway. I looked at the baseboards Warren had painted white over the weekend. In the dim afternoon light, you could still see the dark grain of the pine showing through the cheap white primer in some spots, a reminder of what had been there before the cover-up. I went down to the basement one last time. On the corner of Warren's dusty workbench, beneath a box of old rusty nails, was a stack of extra cedar shakes left over from the house we had built in the valley in '98. I pulled one out. It was weathered, grayed at the edges by 20 years of basement dampness, but one side was still smooth and pale from where my hands had sanded it in the garage. I carried the cedar shake upstairs. I placed it in the center of the clean granite kitchen island. On top of the raw wood, I laid the unsigned listing agreement from Denise Klink. And on top of the agreement, I placed my heavy brass house key. It was the foundation of what we had actually built, left in the middle of the sterile, painted room he had tried to use to erase me. It was the only thing I was leaving behind. I locked the front door behind me, got into my car, and drove away. The gray November afternoon was fading into a cold purple twilight as I turned onto Route 322. The trees along the road were bare, their black branches reaching up toward the pale sky like empty fingers. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest, not happiness, not excitement, but a vast, quiet space where my obligations used to be. A mile down the road, at a red light, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I picked it up. It was a text message from Joanne. "Gail," the message read, "Wesley is in the garage, screaming at his father on the phone, but I just looked up Marin's professional social media page. The address she listed for her new studio, the one she wrote coming soon under last week, is the exact commercial space Wesley helped Dad inspect last month. Dad told us it was for his new consulting office. Oh, Gail, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Is there anything you need?" I looked at the screen, the red light of the traffic signal reflecting in the glass. The truth is a quiet thing, but once it starts to leak, there is no amount of white paint in the world that can keep it from ruining the walls. I typed my reply. "I have everything I need, Joanne. Thank you." I put the phone down, the light turned green, and I drove into the quiet hills of Chester County. The carriage house sat at the end of a long, winding gravel lane lined with ancient, black-barked walnut trees. It was a modest stone building, built in the early 19th century as a coachman's quarters, tucked behind a larger Quaker farmhouse where the owner, an 80-year-old widow named Ruth, lived alone. Ruth had left the porch lamp burning for me. When I unlocked the heavy oak door, the interior smelled of clean pine oil, beeswax, and the dry, sweet scent of old plaster. There were deep stone windowsills, exposed chestnut beams that had never seen a brush of white paint, and a small, black cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the single living room. I unloaded my 2 boxes in the quiet light. I set the photo albums on the low pine bookshelf, placed my grandmother's blanket over the back of the simple corduroy armchair, and set my mother's silver jewelry box on the small dresser in the bedroom alcove. Within 20 minutes, my transition was complete. A small space is a comfort to an exhausted mind. You do not have to wonder what is happening in the other rooms, because there are no other rooms. You only have to manage the space you can see. For 30 years, I had been responsible for 2,000 square feet of drywall, oak flooring, and granite counters, a vast, silent museum of my own isolation. Here there were only 4 stone walls and the sound of the wind moving through the walnut trees outside. I built a small fire in the wood stove using the seasoned oak kindling Ruth had left in a basket nearby. The iron began to crackle as it heated, throwing a warm orange glow across the polished wide plank floorboards. I made a mug of tea and sat in the corduroy chair, letting the heat sink into my lower back and my stiff hip. I pulled my phone from my pocket. There were 11 missed calls from Warren. There were 3 from Wesley and 1 from an unknown number that I suspected belonged to Denise Klink's office. But it was the text messages from Warren that held the real weight of the afternoon's collapse. The first, sent at 2:45 p.m., was sharp and jagged. "You've ruined me. You have no legal right to freeze my business account. It's my name on the LLC. I'm calling the police." The second, sent at 5:12, had begun to tilt. "Gail, answer your phone. Denise is threatening to pull all her listings if we don't settle the title cloud. We are going to lose the equity if we don't list now. Answer me." The third, sent at 7:30, was where the structure had completely fallen inward. "Gail, please, you have to listen to me. Marin, she set this up. She's been manipulating me for months. She told me if I didn't lease the studio and give her the LLC share, she would tell Wesley everything. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to protect our family from her. I'm flying home tomorrow morning. Please don't do this. Let's talk." I stared at the screen, the orange firelight reflecting in the black glass of the phone. A man who spent 30 years building things should know how a load-bearing wall works, but Warren had never understood the weight of his own lies. The second his commercial funding was cut, his credit threatened, and his public reputation put at risk, his grand romance with Marin had evaporated. He had thrown his favorite visionary under the bus in a desperate attempt to salvage his own skin, calling his cowardice an act of protecting the family. He wanted me to believe that he was the victim of a younger woman's malice, expecting me to play the role of the forgiving wife who would help him clean up the mess. He believed that if he apologized enough, blamed her enough, and played the victim enough, I would sign the listing agreement just to make the shouting stop. I didn't reply. I touched the screen, selected his name, and blocked his number. The silence that followed was instant, clean, and absolute. I sat in the warm, small room, listening to the wood in the stove pop and hiss, drinking my tea as the rain began to fall again, a soft, steady patter against the slate roof. At 8:45, the quiet was broken. The gravel outside began to crunch under the weight of tires. Headlights swept across the deep-set stone window of the carriage house, casting long, moving shadows of the walnut branches across the ceiling. I stood up slowly, setting my mug on the table. My hand rested on the back of the corduroy chair, my heart rate accelerating slightly, though my mind remained cold and clear. The car engine cut off. A car door opened, then shut with a heavy, solid thud. Footsteps approached the porch, not the heavy, hurried stomp of Warren's work boots, but a lighter, more hesitant stride. There was a soft, tentative knock on the thick wooden door. I walked across the pine floor, paused for a second to pull my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, and opened the door. Standing on the porch, her hair damp from the cold rain, her arms crossed over her chest to keep warm, was Joanne. "Joanne," I said, stepping back to let her into the warmth of the carriage house. "Come in, you're freezing." She walked inside, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She was wearing a damp yellow raincoat, and her cheeks were bright red from the wind. She looked around the small, stone-walled room, her eyes lingering on the wood stove, the boxes of photo albums, and the tea mugs sitting on the table. "It's beautiful here, Gail," she said, her voice small, trembling slightly as she pulled off her wet hood. "How did you find me?" I asked, walking over to the small kitchen alcove to put the kettle back on the burner. "You left the security deposit receipt on the kitchen desk," Joanne said, stepping closer to the wood stove to warm her hands. "Next to the grocery list on Monday. I saw the Marshallton Farm address when I was looking for a pen. I didn't say anything to Wesley because I think I already knew why you were looking for a place of your own." "Did you?" "The way Warren talked to you at that dinner last week," she said, her eyes fixed on the flickering orange light of the stove. "The way he looked through you, Gail, like you were a housekeeper who had stayed past her shift. It made my stomach turn. I've seen my own father do that to my mother. I know what it looks like when a man has already left a room before he even gets up from the table." A daughter-in-law often sees the truth of a marriage before the children do. She is an observer who entered the family as an adult, free of the childhood myths that make a father look like a giant and a mother look like an appliance. Joanne had not been raised on the legend of Warren Curtis, the master builder. She had only seen the selfish, aging man who expected his wife to shrink so he could feel large. I poured her a cup of chamomile tea and handed it to her, along with a dry towel to dry her hair. "Sit down, Joanne." She sat in the corduroy chair, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug, letting out a long, slow sigh. "Wesley is in a terrible state, Gail. He's not just angry about the divorce. He's terrified." "Terrified of what?" I asked, sitting on the edge of the low pine bench opposite her. 2 weeks ago, Warren asked Wesley to take out a $75,000 home equity line of credit on our house, Joanne said, her voice dropping into a low, tight whisper. He told Wesley it was a guaranteed short-term investment in his new Westchester project. He said he needed some quick bridge funding before the Apex loan cleared, and he promised Wesley a 10% return in 6 months. My hand resting on my knee tightened. Did Wesley do it? He wanted to, Joanne said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He worships his father's business sense. He was ready to sign the paperwork tomorrow morning. But I refused. We had a massive, screaming fight about it on Saturday. I told him we have Maisie's college fund to think about, and our own mortgage is high enough. I told him if his father's business was so solid, he wouldn't need to borrow from his son's equity. She took a small, shaking sip of her tea. Wesley thought I was being paranoid. He said I didn't trust his family. But this afternoon, when the court papers were served and the Apex funding was pulled, Wesley called the bank. The underwriter told him that if he had signed those papers, our home equity would have been directly tied to Warren's personal guarantee. If Warren's LLC defaulted, which it would have now that the house sale is blocked, the bank would have come after our house to clear Warren's debt. The depth of Warren's betrayal was like a dark water that kept rising, filling every room of our lives. He hadn't just been willing to ruin me. He had been willing to sink his own son's young family, to risk his granddaughter's home, all to keep Marin's studio afloat and his own desperate illusion of youth intact. He had used Wesley's admiration as a shovel to dig a hole that would have buried us all. "That's why Wesley is screaming in the garage, Gail," Joanne said, her voice cracking. "He's furious at you because it's easier than admitting his father was going to bankrupt us for his mistress. He can't face the truth yet. He's trying to protect the lie, because if the lie dies, he has to admit his father is a monster." "Wesley is his father's son," I said quietly. "He's been taught that a man's pride is worth more than a woman's security. He'll have to unlearn that on his own." "I told him I'm staying with my mother tonight," Joanne said, setting her mug down. "I couldn't stand to be in that house with him while he's defending Warren. I needed to see you. I needed to make sure you were safe." "I am safe, Joanne," I said, reaching out to cover her damp hand with mine. "For the first time in 30 years, I am completely safe." Suddenly, the quiet of the Marshallton lane was shattered. The sound of a heavy, fast-moving engine tore through the dark. Gravel sprayed against the stone walls of the carriage house as a car rounded the walnut trees, its tires screeching on the wet stone before coming to a violent, sudden halt in the driveway. Blinding white high beams flooded through the window, cutting across the room and painting Joanne's face in a stark, frozen white. The car door slammed shut with a metallic bang that echoed through the trees. "Joanne!" a voice shouted from the dark, raw, furious, and thick with rain. It was Wesley. "Joanne, open the door! I know your car is here! Open the damn door!" He ran up the wooden steps of the porch, his heavy boots slamming against the planks, before he began to beat his fists against the oak door, the entire frame of the carriage house vibrating under his weight. "Joanne, get out here!" "Gail, don't," Joanne whispered, her face pale, her hands trembling as she set her tea mug down on the table. "He's out of his mind right now. He's never been like this." I didn't answer. I stood up, smoothing the front of my gray cardigan. I felt no fear, no racing pulse, no urge to hide behind the heavy oak door. When you have spent 30 years absorbing a family's emotional damage in silence, you eventually become immune to the noise they make when they are hurting. I walked to the door, slid the brass bolt back, and pulled it open. Wesley was standing on the wet porch, his leather jacket dark with rain, his chest heaving under his damp shirt. His fists were still raised, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a frantic, desperate anger. Behind him, the headlights of his SUV cut through the mist, illuminating the steady downpour. "Joanne, get your things!" he gasped, ignoring me entirely as he tried to look past my shoulder into the warm interior of the carriage house. "We're leaving right now. You had no right to come here, and you had no right to go through my desk and look at my papers." "She didn't go through your desk, Wesley," I said, my voice low, calm, and perfectly flat. "She looked at the kitchen counter where your father's lease receipt was sitting. And you will not raise your voice on this porch." Wesley's eyes snapped to mine. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger, a woman who had somehow taken his mother's place. In his mind, I was the quiet, soft-spoken woman who had spent his childhood making school lunches and apologizing for his father's moods. He had never heard me speak with authority because I had always surrendered my authority to keep his father quiet.
"You ruined him, Mom," Wesley said, his voice cracking, the anger in his chest twisting into a boy's raw, wounded betrayal. "He's at the airport in Philly right now. He took the first emergency flight out of Savannah. He's ruined. His business is dead. His reputation is gone. And he's going to lose everything because of what you did today. How could you do that to him? After 30 years, how could you just tear our family apart?" A boy who has spent his life believing his father's strength is a shield will fight twice as hard to protect the shield, even when it is being used to crush his own family. He does not want to see that the shield is made of paper. Wesley was 31 years old, a husband and a father, but standing in the rain on my porch, he was still the 10-year-old boy who wanted to believe his father was invincible. "I didn't tear our family apart, Wesley," I said, stepping onto the wet porch, closing the door behind me slightly so Joanne remained in the warmth. The cold rain began to mist against my face, but I didn't flinch. "Your father did that when he decided that a 32-year-old girl's business was worth more than his granddaughter's college fund. He did that when he asked you to take out a $75,000 line of credit on your home to clear her debts." "It was an investment," Wesley shouted, his shoulders shaking. "Dad's always made money. He's always known what he was doing." "Then why did Apex Commercial freeze his loan today?" I asked, my voice dropping even lower, forcing him to lean in to hear me over the sound of the rain. "They ran a standard credit and title search, Wesley. They found out that your father had pledged a home that belongs to both of us without my knowledge or consent. That is fraud, Wesley. He was attempting to commit fraud using my security. If Joanne hadn't refused to sign your papers on Saturday, you would have been personally liable for that lease when his funding collapsed today. Do you think your father would have paid you back with his assets frozen and our house in litigation?" Wesley stared at me, his jaw dropping slightly, his eyes moving back and forth as the cold, hard logic of the situation finally began to sink through his anger. He tried to speak, his lips parting, but no sound came out. "Joanne didn't betray you, Wesley," I said softly. "She saved you, and I saved myself. Your father was going to use both of us as scaffolding to build a life for another woman, and then he was going to let us collapse when he didn't need us anymore." Wesley's shoulders slumped. The frantic, manic energy that had brought him screaming up my driveway began to drain away, leaving him looking wet, small, and hollow in the dim light of the porch lamp. He reached out, his hand gripping the wet wooden railing of the porch to steady himself. "He's coming here, Mom," Wesley whispered, looking up at me through his wet hair, his voice suddenly devoid of any anger. "He called me from the terminal in Philadelphia. He was hysterical. He was screaming at me, demanding to know where Joanne was, because he knew she'd know where you went. I was so angry, Mom. I told him." "I know, Wesley," I said, looking past him toward the end of the gravel lane. "It's all right." Just then, a second set of headlights appeared at the end of the walnut lane. The car was moving slowly, almost ghost-like through the wet fog,
its high beams cutting through the trees and illuminating the wet stone of the driveway. It was Warren's sedan. He didn't speed up and he didn't screech his tires. He drove with a slow, heavy deliberation, the red taillights of his car disappearing into the mist behind him as he pulled up next to Wesley's SUV. The headlights cut off, leaving only the amber running lights glowing in the dark. The car door opened, and Warren stepped out into the rain. Warren walked up the wooden steps of the porch. He was 60 years old, but in the harsh yellow glow of the carriage house lamp, he looked 70. His gray wool coat was soaked, clinging to his shoulders like a heavy, wet pelt, and his silver hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain. He was no longer the confident, energetic consultant who had sat at my kitchen island 5 days ago, lecturing me on the necessity of white paint and modern design. He looked like a man who had spent the last 6 hours sitting in a cramped airplane seat, watching his entire life turn to ash. He stopped at the top of the steps. He looked at Wesley, who was still leaning against the wet wooden railing, his face pale and hollow. "Go to your car, Wesley," Warren said, his voice dry, raspy, and stripped of its usual resonant authority. "I need to talk to your mother." Wesley didn't move. He looked at his father's wet, exhausted face, searching for the giant he had spent his life trying to please. But the giant was gone. In his place was only a desperate, aging contractor who had been caught trying to steal from his own children. "Did you do it, Dad?" Wesley asked, his voice barely louder than the patter of the rain on the slate roof. "Were you going to let me sign those equity papers tomorrow? Knowing the Apex loan was contingent on Mom's signature?" Warren's eyes flickered, a brief defensive anger crossing his face, before it was washed away by the rain. "It was a bridge loan, Wesley. It was standard restructuring. I was going to pay you back within 90 days. I've always taken care of you." "No," Wesley said, his voice dropping into a flat, hollow whisper. "You were taking care of yourself. You were going to use my house to back her lease." Warren didn't answer. He turned his back on his son, his boots creaking on the wet planks as he stepped closer to me. "You have to drop the Liz Pendens, Gail," he said, his voice shaking slightly, his hands balling into fists inside his wet pockets. "I've been on the phone with Apex's legal team from the gate at Philly. They're giving me 48 hours to clear the title cloud on the house, or they're canceling the commercial lease permanently and suing the LLC for breach of contract. If they do that, the Westchester landlord will come after the personal guarantee." "Let them," I said, my voice quiet, matching the steady rhythm of the autumn rain. "Are you stupid?" Warren hissed, stepping closer, his face flushing with a sudden, desperate rage. "If they foreclose on the guarantee, they'll take the house anyway. The split level will go to a forced sale. You'll lose your half of the equity, Gail. We'll both walk away with nothing. Is that what you want? To sleep in this damp, stoned shed for the rest of your life because you wanted to prove a point?" A man who has spent 30 years being feared doesn't know how to speak when his power is gone. He only knows how to repeat the old threats, hoping the echo will be enough to make you shrink back into the corner where you belong. But I was no longer inside his house, and I was no longer afraid of the dark. "They cannot touch my half of the equity, Warren," I said, my voice steady, slow, letting every word land like cold water. I spent the morning with Monica Vance. Because the deed of our home is in both of our names, and because I never signed your personal guarantee or the lease agreement, the guarantee only applies to your 50% share of the marital estate. The lenders can place a lien on your half, and they can take your half to clear your debts. But my half is protected by the court. Warren froze. His chest stayed high, his breath caught in his throat, as the legal reality of what I had done finally settled over him. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his lips parting slightly, as he realized that the door he had planned to slip through had been locked from the outside. "When the court orders the partition sale of our home," I continued, "my $340,000 will be paid to me in full. Your $340,000 will go to Apex, the Westchester landlord, and Denise Klink's listing fees. You are the only one who is going to walk away with nothing, Warren." The silence on the porch was absolute. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic dripping of the rain from the eaves onto the gravel below. Warren's shoulders began to curve inward, his wet linen shirt clinging to his ribs as if he were shrinking inside his own skin. He turned slowly to look at Wesley, his hands coming out of his pockets, his fingers reaching out in a silent, desperate plea. "Wesley," Warren whispered, his voice cracking, the proud father entirely gone. "Wesley, tell her. Tell her she's destroying the family. Talk some sense into her. We can't let the bank take the equity. It's everything we have." Wesley looked at his father's outstretched hands. He looked at the wet silver hair, the dark gray coat, and the desperate hollow eyes. The rain dripped from Wesley's chin, but he didn't wipe it away. He slowly let go of the wet wooden railing, stepped down off the porch steps, and walked toward his SUV. "Wesley!" Warren called out, his voice rising in panic. "Wesley!" Wesley didn't look back. He opened the door of the carriage house, his eyes meeting Joanne's, where she stood in the warm light of the kitchen. "Let's go, Joanne," Wesley said, his voice small, tired, but completely clear. "We're going to your mother's." Joanne stepped out onto the porch, her yellow raincoat bright against the dark stone. She gave me a quiet, supportive nod as she passed me, her hand brushing mine for a fraction of a second. She and Wesley got into his SUV, the engine starting with a low rumble that drowned out the rain. They backed down the gravel lane, their headlights sweeping across the walnut trees one last time before disappearing into the dark mist. Warren and I were left alone on the wet porch. The red taillights of Wesley's car faded into the fog at the end of the lane, leaving only the amber running lights of Warren's sedan glowing in the dark driveway. Warren stood in the cold rain, his head bowed, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He had spent 30 years holding everyone together through fear, manipulation, and the silent leverage of his own success. But tonight, there was no one left to hold. "Can I come in, Gail?" Warren's voice was barely a whisper, muffled by the sound of the rain cascading off his wet hair. He looked up at me, his lip trembling with the cold. "Just for 5 minutes, to get dry. I'm freezing." I stood in the doorway, my cardigan pulled tight, the warm, cedar-scented air of the carriage house brushing against my back. "No, Warren," I said, "you can't." He leaned his shoulder against the rough stone of the doorframe, his head dropping as if he could no longer hold up the weight of his own skull. He let out a long, wet breath that turned into a shuddering sigh. "I was just so tired, Gail," he murmured, his voice flat, empty of any of the anger or pride he had carried onto the porch. "Retired, my joints aching every morning, the doctor telling me my heart wasn't what it used to be. I looked in the mirror and I saw a dead man. I saw my father's face looking back at me. And then Marin. She looked at me like I still had something to build, like I was still important. I just wanted to feel like I wasn't finished. I just wanted to feel alive before the lights went out. An aging man will burn down his own house just to feel the warmth of the fire one last time. He doesn't think about where he will sleep when the ashes go cold. He thinks only of the heat on his skin, convinced that his desperation is a form of tragedy rather than a common, selfish panic. "We were both getting older, Warren," I said, my voice quiet, completely steady. "My hip has been aching for 5 years. My skin has been drying out under the same kitchen lights as yours. But I didn't try to buy my youth with your life. I didn't try to erase you to make myself feel young." "I'm sorry, Gail," he said, and for the first time in 34 years, the words sounded like they might have cost him something. "I'm sorry. Please, let's just figure this out. We can sell the house, split it, and I'll clear the LLC. I'll walk away from Marin. I'll do whatever you want." "Marin has already walked away from you, Warren," I said softly, "and you don't have anything left to offer me. Go back to the split level. The paint on the baseboards should be dry by now." I stepped back into the carriage house, closed the heavy oak door, and slid the brass bolt into place. I stood in the silence of the entry hall, my hand resting on the smooth wood of the door. Outside, there was no sound of shouting, no pounding on the oak, and no desperate demands. There was only the quiet, wet crunch of his boots on the gravel as he walked back to his sedan, followed by the low, rumbling start of his engine. I watched the yellow headlights sweep across the stone walls one last time before his car turned onto the main road, the sound of his tires fading into the Marshallton mist. On Thursday morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the Chester County hills washed in a brilliant, cold autumn sunlight. The bare walnut trees stood sharp and black against a pale blue sky, and the frost on the grass sparkled like crushed glass. I sat on the small stone porch of the carriage house, wrapped in my grandmother's blanket, drinking a cup of hot black tea. Ruth had walked over from the main farmhouse earlier to leave a basket of fresh eggs and a loaf of sourdough bread on my step, giving me a quiet, respectful nod before walking back to her gardens. My phone buzzed on the low wooden table next to me. I picked it up. It was Monica Vance. "Good morning, Gail." Monica's voice was crisp, professional, and carried a quiet note of satisfaction. "I wanted to give you an update. Marin Keller's legal counsel contacted my office 45 minutes ago." I took a slow sip of my tea. "Did they?" "Yes," Monica said, and I could hear the rustle of papers on her desk. "She is formally rescinding any association with Warren's Consulting LLC, and her lawyer has sent over a signed affidavit stating that she was misled regarding Warren's authority to pledge his residential assets. She's claiming she had no knowledge that the Westchester lease guarantee was tied to a marital home without your consent. She's protecting her brand, I said. Of course she is, Monica agreed. The moment the commercial underwriters pulled the lease and the Liz Pendens was recorded, she realized Warren was no longer a golden ticket. He's a financial liability and a public relations disaster. She's cut him loose to save her own studio. She wants nothing to do with him. And Warren? He's been calling my office every hour since 8 a.m., Monica said. His lawyer called, too, wanting to discuss an immediate settlement. They're offering to waive his claim to his portion of the joint savings and sign over the remaining LLC funds if we agree to lift the Liz Pendens so he can sell his share of the house to clear the commercial default. We're not lifting it yet, I said. Absolutely not, Monica said, her voice hard, protective. We hold all the cards now, Gail. He's default contracted in Westchester, and Denise Klink is about to sue him for her marketing costs. We let him stew for a week. We'll dictate the terms of the settlement, and we will make sure your $340,000 remains entirely unencumbered. Get some rest. I'll call you on Monday. Thank you, Monica, I said. I hung up the phone and set it back on the table. I looked out over the rolling hills of the farm, the cold wind carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and wet earth. The structure of my old life was completely gone, but as I sat in the morning sun, I realized that I didn't miss the roof. I didn't miss the walls. I only felt the vast, clean sky above me. At 11 o'clock, the phone rang again. I looked at the screen. It was Wesley. I hesitated for a second before I slid my thumb across the glass to answer. Hello, Wesley. Mom? His voice was quiet, small, and heavy with a deep exhaustion. I'm sorry about last night. I was out of my mind. It's all right, Wesley, I said, my voice soft. You were shocked. No, it's not all right, he said. I could hear the creak of his porch swing. He was at his mother-in-law's house, likely watching Maisie play in the yard. I stayed up all night talking to Joanne. She reminded me of something. Do you remember when I was 12 and you went to stay with Aunt Cheryl in Ohio for 2 weeks? You told me you just needed a break to help her with her new baby. My breath caught in my chest for a fraction of a second. The memory of that autumn in '97 returned. The cold, empty bedroom, the silent house, and the desperate, quiet panic of a 38-year-old woman who had just found another woman's lipstick in her husband's truck. I remember, I said quietly. Did Dad? Wesley's voice cracked, a young man's realization finally breaking through the decades of childhood denial. Did he do this back then, too? Is that why you left? Did he do this back then, too? Wesley's voice was barely a whisper over the line. Is that why you left? The wind swept across the stone porch of the carriage house, carrying a few dry walnut leaves across my lap. I looked out over the quiet, rolling Chester County hills, remembering the cold, paralyzing terror of that autumn in 1997. I remembered the red lipstick on the collar of his work shirt, the late-night emergencies at his job sites, and the way he had looked at me with that same cold, dismissive contempt, as if my presence in his house were a chore he was tired of paying for. Yes, Wesley, I said, my voice quiet, completely steady. He did. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the dry rustle of the wind in the trees where he sat. "Why did you come back, Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking, the last remnants of his childhood illusions finally falling away. "If you knew what he was, why did you come back to him?" "Because you were 12, I replied softly, "and because a mother doesn't leave her children to clean up a mess they didn't make. I stayed until you and your sister were old enough and strong enough to stand on your own. I stayed until the work of holding up his life was finally yours to see." "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, and for the first time in his adult life, he sounded like a son who truly saw his mother. "I'm so, so sorry." "You don't need to apologize, Wesley," I said. "Just take care of Joanne and Maisie. Build something real with them. Don't build a monument to yourself." "I will," he said. "I promise." 6 months later, the Delaware County Court ordered the partition sale of our split-level home. Denise Klink handled the sale, though she did not use the cheap white primer Warren had painted over our baseboards to sell it. The buyers were a young couple with a newborn baby. They planned to tear out the oak trim, replace the granite with white quartz, and gut the bathrooms to make the space modern. They saw the house as a blank slate, entirely oblivious to the decades of silent labor that had kept the plaster from cracking. The house sold for $675,000. The division of the escrow was cold, mathematical, and absolute. My check was for exactly $337,500, unencumbered, clean, and deposited into a personal account in my name alone. Warren's share of the proceeds was immediately seized by the county sheriff to satisfy the default judgments against his LLC. The Westchester landlord's breach of contract lawsuit, Apex Commercial's legal fees, and Denise Klink's marketing expenses swallowed his equity to the penny. He walked away from the courtroom with less than $12,000 and a mountain of personal debt he could never pay off. Maren Keller did not wait for the litigation to clear. The moment the commercial lease was frozen, she blocked Warren's number, rebranded her design firm under a different corporate name, and moved her operations to Philadelphia. She left him in the dust of his own collapsed plans, entirely indifferent to the 60-year-old man who had ruined his family to buy her a 5-year lease. Warren had to rent a small, damp basement apartment in a rundown section of Norristown. Wesley told me about it during our Sunday phone calls. The apartment had low ceilings, linoleum floors, and cheap, buzzing fluorescent tubes in the kitchen, the exact fluorescent lighting he had once used to mock my aging face. Now Warren was the one who sat alone under that cold, harsh glare. He was the one whose skin looked gray, whose hair looked thin, and whose eyes looked permanently disappointed. He had nothing left to remind him of the master builder he used to be, save for a scratched silver watch that no longer kept correct time. They call it karma, but it isn't always a sudden, dramatic explosion. Sometimes karma is simply the quiet, relentless weight of a life built on selfishness, finally collapsing inward under its own gravity. It is the silent, natural consequence of treating the people who love you like scaffolding, only to realize that when you kick them away, there is nothing left to hold up your roof. I sat on the porch of the carriage house as the first soft flakes of winter snow began to drift down through the bare walnut trees. The air was clean, cold, and smelled of wood smoke. On the low pine table next to me sat the weathered cedar shake from 1998. I picked it up, my thumb running over the smooth, pale side my hands had sanded so many years ago. I was 58 years old, and my skin was wrinkled, my hair was silver, and my hip was stiff in the cold. But as I watched the snow cover the quiet hills of Chester County, I realized that I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a ghost moving through another man's house. I was finally home. Life has a quiet, powerful way of balancing the scales when we least expect it. The loudest actions often lead to the most silent defeats, and those who choose to build their success on the unseen sacrifices of others eventually find themselves standing in the cold ruins of their own design. If you found peace and satisfaction in Gail's journey of patience, resilience, and quiet justice, we invite you to join our community. Please subscribe to Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we explore the deep, human, and unforgettable truths of lives rewritten by the silent hands of fate. Click the subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know, have you ever had to quietly step away and watch a structure collapse under its own weight? Thank you for listening, and may the structures you build always hold you warm.